Thank you for joining us today. This is Simpatico's CMMC 2.0 webinar with Jeremiah Cohen, Corey Ruthard, and Chris Ramirez. Today we're going to talk about how the new changes to CMMC 2.0 might affect you in the future, but we're also going to address FAR, DFARS, SPRS, and all of the rulemaking that exists right now and how that can impact you today in your existing contracts. We're going to start out today by looking at a couple of the different changes, and to do that, we're going to bring in Jeremiah Cohen. Jeremiah, you want to introduce yourself to our guests?
Sure. Thanks, Corey. Appreciate that. Yeah, I'm Jeremiah Cohen, the Chief Information Security Officer with Simpatico Systems. I've been with the company almost 9 years. I oversee our Security Operations Center and the cyber division within the organization. As you can see, I've got a number of cybersecurity certifications there, really the alphabet soup of some of that stuff. Including some Microsoft certifications from early on in my career, and I've been doing this for about 22 years.
Awesome. Really excited to have you on the call today, Jeremiah. I know you've got a lot of experience in this industry and working through this. I will also be involved in the conversation today, kind of DJing here a little bit. My experience, I've been with Simpatico for about 9 years, worked in the industry for the last 22 years and various roles, CIO currently for Simpatico Systems, and very actively involved in what we're doing within that security landscape as well. Also joining us today is Chris Ramirez, the VP of Sales and Marketing for Simpatico Systems. Chris, can you introduce yourself to our guests?
Yes, thanks, Corey. Jeremiah. Yeah, I oversee sales and marketing for Simpatico. I have extensive background in sales and leadership. And I'm just glad to be part of today's call.
An honorary part of the nerd herd, right?
Yes, yes.
All right, so for talking today about this discussion on CMMC 2.0, the first thing we want to talk about is kind of a disclaimer in this, is that rulemaking for CMMC has not really been officially codified into Code of Federal Regulations. So all the information that we're talking about and what's been provided is the things that have been shared publicly by DoD officials and the collective knowledge of industry experts. Those are a lot of our peers that we talk with day to day, looking at what potential impacts this may have. All of this information is provided with the intent of providing value to all of those that are impacted by the rulemakings, everyone in that defense industrial base. Simpatico is not responsible for any misinformation that's been disseminated through these respected channels and reiterated in this webinar. So our topics for today, we're going to be talking about CMMC 2.0 rulemaking and the timeline for that, FAR, DFARS, and the contractual requirements as they exist today, and the current impact of FAR, DFARS, and SPRS to the defense industrial base, so all DoD contractors. Jeremiah, do you want to start off with talking about CMMC 2.0 rulemaking for us?
Yeah, thanks, Corey. So, there's been a lot of talk about CMMC over the last couple of years. We've had a couple different iterations of that from 1.0 to 2.0. We expected some of that as it progressed over that period of time. And so now there's some reticence from the defense industrial base, these contractors, because of all of the stuff that's sort of up in the air. They're concerned about making decisions, right? As anybody should, right? If I'm going to make financial decisions for my organization, I have to make technical or administrative changes. I want to make sure I'm doing the right thing. And so that's caused some reticence, but we're starting to get some more refined information and get some more detailed, defined timelines. And so what we've heard is that in March of 2023, that there's going to be an interim rule released, and based on that, there will be a 60-day comment period for the public to add their perspective and any issues they might see with what's been brought down. Part of that is there's mandatory rulemaking obligations for CMMC that the DoD has to address so that we can get this codified into as part of official rulemaking. Once the official rulemaking comes down in potentially May of 2023, we're going to have definitely a clearer indication and direction of what CMMC 2.0 actually looks like. And from that point forward, we can start progressing with the actual codified rules.
Okay, Jeremiah. So when we're talking about the timeline here, we're looking at this rulemaking for 9 to 24 months. That was all pre-COVID, before we had all the breakdown. What does the timeline really look like right now? What should contractors expect when we're talking about implementation of 2.0 and where we feel like it's really going to happen?
Yeah, exactly. We got that information some time ago. It wasn't really clear kind of when 2.0 came out. And then we got some clear indication from the DoD on when that was going to happen. The rumor was it was going to be sometime sort of early spring or summer of 2023, and that's essentially what we got. And so what we're hearing now is from a statement from the DoD's director, Stacy Bosjanek, essentially, who's the person managing the CMMC program. She stated that the rulemaking process around CMMC will be completed in March 2023. This opens the door to that 2.0 language actually being visible in contracts. So they're going to start doing that. I mean, their position is they're going to start doing that 60 days later after the comment period has been completed. So that's when this will have been codified. That will be the letter of the law, and compliance from a contractual perspective will begin.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So coming from the director of DoD program here, we're saying maybe it looks more like May of 23 is when this really might take effect.
That's correct.
So now that we know a little bit more about the timeline and the potential impact of 2.0 in May of 23, we know that that's still not going to really make an impact to the existing obligations for contractors with FAR and DFARS, right?
Yeah, that's correct, Corey. So, that's one of the misconceptions right now that we're hearing a lot out in the wild, right? People have sort of got it in their mind of like, CMMC is just taking over. That's the thing I have to pay attention to. When it's been codified, I'll pay attention to it. But really, that doesn't negate any of the contractual requirements that you have in your existing contracts. And so a lot of the conversation that I have with the DIB, with these OSCs, the organizations seeking certification, is what is in your current contracts? Who's managing that? Have you actually looked at the language in there to ensure what it states? Because essentially you've agreed to that contract, you have to uphold the requirements. And a lot of that we're seeing is, by default, if you have a contract with the DoD, you already have to adhere to the FAR 52-204-21, which is that federal acquisition regulation, which is basic safeguarding of that contracting information, right? So, and the FAR 52-204-21 essentially equates, or it does equate to, a CMMC level 1, but it doesn't just go away because CMMC is coming. So by default, you still have that those 15 controls to adhere to, and even more so from a larger scale, that is a massive impact to these contractors that is really not being taken serious, in my opinion. Is that there's DFARS language in a lot of these contracts that we're seeing out in the wild that do state either explicitly or in some way referring to the fact that if you're engaged in this contract, you have to adhere to that DFARS clause, which is essentially the full 110 controls from NIST 800-171. So yes, that equates to future state, next year CMMC 2.0 level 2, but under that contract, we still have those requirements.
Understood. And when we're talking about these two requirements, we're talking about FAR regulation. We're also talking about DFARS. So the FAR really only pertains to those contractors that have the contract information, but maybe not any of the sensitive data that goes with that, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, we're talking about just protecting the actual contract information, right? And there's pieces in that we're talking about. Some of that stuff is public through the request for proposal information for quote process, but you still have an obligation as a contractor to make sure you're at least safeguarding that information, that's not getting out. And so there are those 15 basic safeguards And we do have that listed here, or you can see on the slide if anyone wants to go and understand what those specific safeguarding controls are. It doesn't relieve the contractor from any of this. Again, CMMC doesn't just negate this. It still has to be adhered to. And this is applicable also for subcontracts, right? In addition to the contractor that has signed for this as a part to fulfill this contract, any subcontractors they have that essentially have FCI or federal contract information residing or transiting through their system, right? Being processed, transmitted, or stored in their environment in relation to that contract, they also have that same, FAR 52, 204, 21, 15 basic safeguarding control requirements to adhere to that, the requirements of that contract.
So Jeremiah, the FAR language we know is included in every contract that comes across, both for the contractors and the subcontractors you're talking about. And that's going to be really the biggest majority of people that are subject to these new rules coming out for CMMC 2.0. They're still going to have the FAR contract, and that's going to impact everybody. How many really do you think are going to hit that DFARS CUI data level 2 for CMMC? Are we seeing a majority of the defense industrial base really needing that DFARS clause or the level 2, or are most of them really just going to have that FAR regulation?
That's a good question, Corey. There's a lot of speculation around the total number of the contractors within the defense industrial base from the get-go. The counts that are publicized, I think, are mostly on that, prime, the higher tier structure within that organization, within the DoD. But there are potentially, upwards of 1 million plus overall contractors when we count all of the pieces throughout that tiered structured chain. And not all of them are going to have the same requirements, to your point. And so what we're understanding is that a majority of those are going to be a level 1. Which is going to be that DFAR, or the FAR regulation with that 15 safeguarding, which is going to equate to CMMC level 1. Now, there are going to be those that that have the DFARS requirements, and one of the issues that we've been seeing here, and a lot of contractors are facing, is their current contractual requirements state that they have DFARS requirements in there, but in actuality, based on what we understand through definitions of what FAR, FCI, Federal Contract Information, equates to, and what CUI equates to, we're seeing that there's a mismatch there, which is part of what CMMC is going to correct in that whole process from contracting officers to the contractors. And what we're seeing is their previous requirements are requiring them to be DFARS compliant with the 110 controls under NIST 800-171. In all actuality, they don't really have CUI, and it's historically has not been properly marked, which CMMC 2.0 intends to correct. And then the future state is that they potentially will be classified as a level 1, where they really only have federal contract information and not CUI. And so there's this conundrum of, I have to do this up to this point to adhere to these requirements. Future state, I have to adhere to these. And when you're talking about the small contractors, 10 less, even 20. I mean, even some of these smaller ones, for them to adhere to those controls, that 110 requirement, could be significantly impactful to their organization. Only to get to the point of CMMC then stating, hey, this contract you've been in is really, we've classified this as you only have federal contract information, and now you only have these 15 safeguarding controls. And so again, this has sort of led to some of the reticence of the defense industrial base actually doing anything. But again, that doesn't negate the contractual requirements for any existing contracts. If you've signed and agreed to that contract, regardless of the implementation or codification of CMMC 2.0, you do have a legal requirement to fulfill that. Now, something may happen along the way as they work that out, as far as how they're going to handle that. And they have pushed some of that stuff back to the contracting officers to handle that. But we don't want to negate that is a true statement. You do have contractual obligations on past and will in the future with CMMC.
So there is a potential that we're going to actually see a lot of these contractors that may get a little bit of a respite when we get into CMMC 2.0, where maybe they're not subjected to the really complex requirements we're seeing in DFARS. They may be going from that 110 control requirement down to 15 in a lot of those instances.
That's correct. And so you can understand the reticence of why should I go through all of this only to have CMMC 2.0 tell me this, which is an understandable statement. But again, when we start talking about legality and contractual requirements, you've signed that, you must adhere to it. And so obviously there's a difference in the requirements from what DFARS was before and what CMMC 2.0 is going to be. Which is that third-party assessor organization validating that. And so this is why we're having the conversation about what do contractors need to do to adhere to current state to make sure that they're in line and don't face any ramifications from that, and in preparation for CMMC 2.0 coming down.
Thank you, Jeremiah. That brings up a great point. And we're talking about all of the stuff that could be future state, CMMC 2.0. We think it could be May of 23. Everybody, I think, really wants to know, how does this impact me right now? What should I be doing? What are the things that may come back and bite me if I'm not really paying attention to at this point? Can you talk to that with us a little bit?
Yeah, so in June of 2022, the Acquisition and Sustainment Office internally issued a memorandum for contract remedies, basically stating what are we going to do? So they've been putting the squeeze on sort of both ends, right? Future state of CMMC, this is coming, prepare, and then sort of the lackadaisical attitude, in my opinion, of just the overall system when we talk about DFARS. That self-attestation is how do we now force that back end as well, so that people aren't doing exactly what we're talking about. Is I'm not going to do anything until I'm forced to do something in the future. And so what's happened is they've basically given the contracting officers some power in both power and responsibility, right? With great power comes responsibility. Giving them some remedies to help sort of encourage that. Is the nice way to put it. But essentially, if you don't have an SPRS score and the contracting officers are being held responsible for that, and they're looking at their existing contracts and they say, hey, this contractor A has not submitted a self-assessment under DFARS to the SPRS, the SPRS system, then you're essentially could be held as sort of in breach of contract. Right? Because they're wanting to see, are you actually conforming? Have you done this? I could understand this is sort of a CYA from both sides. And so what's happening is they've been sending out notices to primes and then some of the subcontractors that essentially if you don't meet this requirement, then there's a number of things that could happen, right? And they're sending out non-compliance, they're sending out non-conformity, if you don't have this SPRS submission. And so a couple things is they're not going to allow for any sort of modification when that comes up, or option years. And this could definitely impact end of year payments or larger payments based on those contracts. And so it's going to start impacting you potentially financially, or even to the point of losing that contract if you are not adhering to those DFARS requirements. And part of that is the SPRS submission. And so they want to ensure this is sort of an ad hoc way of enforcing that we're submitting the SPRS while we're adhering to the DFARS requirements in preparation for CMMC 2.0.
That's right. So as of June 2020, with that new memo that came out from Acquisition and Sustainment, a lot of those payments or contract renewals or even eligibility for those options are kind of in jeopardy at this point, aren't they? If Defense Industrial Base is now putting those SPRS scores in, there's some potential financial impacts there.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we're seeing that, some contractors we deal with personally or work with personally, have received some of these stating you need to do these things. You need to have an SPRS submission in here. You need to have an up-to-date plan of action and milestone. You need to have an up-to-date system security plan. And if you can't validate those things, then the contracting officer is, now it's on them. They are going to protect themselves in that aspect, and it's going to come down on the contractor. And so, like I said, it's going to be withholding payments, foregoing contract renewals or options, and potentially just terminating the contract in whole if you're at a certain level of risk. I have heard rumors that there's going to be a sort of minimum threshold as far as the scoring goes. So it's not necessarily, hey, you have to be at 110, but there's a minimum threshold you need to be meeting and show compliance with having those other documents. So definitely could be, impactful current day.
Thank you for that, Jeremiah. Now, when we're talking about, the FAR regulation, DFAR regulation, CMMC coming up, what should we be focused on right now? What should contractors be looking at and doing specifically for FAR? What should those contractors be doing right now?
Yeah, so exactly to that point, Corey, there should be action being taken right now by the contractors, regardless of what level you have. If you have a contract, you have requirements. As we mentioned before, under FAR, you have those 15 basic safeguarding controls that you should be adhering to. Again, we've provided those here in the slide to go look that up. A simple Google search will get you the answer of what those 15 safeguards are. So really that's step number one, is make sure you're adhering to those safeguards. Do you have those in place, and can you prove that in the event that you needed to, right? We know that level ones are going to be self-attestation, and we know under FAR, DFARS, that wasn't really something that was assessed or audited, but could be a liability in the event that something happens. Additionally, we want to make sure that any of the subcontractors that any of these contractors are engaging in is making sure that that substance of that is included in that contract with any of their subcontractors who might have FCI residing or transiting through their information systems. And lastly is to do sort of a self-attestation, which is really that checking to ensure and validating those 15 safeguards have been met. And as mentioned, it's highly suggested that you have a body of evidence to produce in the event that you have to prove your compliance should you be asked to. So just stating, in my opinion, yeah, I am, we do these things is not going to fly. The tides have changed. There will be some requirement to show that you're doing that. And so, under FAR, it's a little bit or a lot lighter, but you do have to be purposeful in attaining that information and providing that should you need to.
Gotcha. And when we're talking about DFARS, what does that look like? Same kind of approach for the DFARS contractors as well?
Yeah, DFARS is a little bit more entailed, right? Because now we're talking about organizations that have CUI, or the contract has identified based on that requirement being in the contract that we have CUI. And so again, first thing I say to contractors is have you looked at your contracts? Does it have DFARS clause in that contract in the language? And that's step number one. Most of the time, it is in there, and they weren't clear about that, and it's a little bit of a surprise. And so we don't want to be surprised when we're being audited or assessed by the DoD or a C3PAO. So step two is make sure that you have that SPRS score submitted, right? Even though these are supplements to the original DFARS clause 7012, there's still that self-attestation that was required for SPRS score. And so we want to make sure we have those in there. And that includes, again, subcontracting all the way down. If CUI is either being processed, transmitted, or stored within those environments. And the third part that we're going to want to do is, you can't really protect what you don't know. And so a lot of the contractors I speak to, when I say, hey, do you understand how this information is flowing through your environment, whether it's FCI or CUI, they're like, oh, well, I sort of know, and this person, they have a general idea of the people and sort of the departments that are doing that, but they really don't even know what they're doing with it to some degree. And so step 3 is understand that data flow, establish that, even if it's, a rudimentary drawing or a verbal description of how am I attaining this information, this FCI or CUI through contracting. How does that come into my environment? Where does it go? How is it stored? Who are the people, process, and technology that are store, processing, and transmitting that information, and visualize that, because that is going to help with step 4, which is defining that scope boundary. Because when we talk about scope, an assessor or an audit is going to be based on the scope. And if we're defining the scope as being the entire environment because we haven't created a data flow diagram, that opens you up for a lot of trouble, essentially, if you weren't prepared for that. And so really defining that scope and boundary with that data flow diagram is really going to narrow the field of where are my gaps, right? Which is the next piece of, if I'm doing that self-attestation and I'm looking at where am I supposed to be against the NIST controls, 800-171, those 110 controls, that gives you an idea of, hey, where am I against this scope? And that is going to be key, because that's where all your effort, time, and money is going to go to make sure you're adhering to those controls. Additionally, as I mentioned before, one of the key requirements under DFARS is that you have to have a plan of action and milestone. And that is the output of doing that self-assessment against those 110 controls, which is essentially, if you've submitted your SPRS score, that's the residual. And in that document, you're saying, here's where I am against 110 controls, here's what's been implemented, not implemented, or sort of in between, and sort of we're working on it. And then setting those dates and when you plan to accomplish or meet that milestone. That's critical, and it has to be up to date so you can show intent, right? That's due care, due diligence, to show your intent to meet the requirement. And the another key piece is the system security plan. I equate the system security plan to the cliff notes of your environment, the really refined, direct information that should be the story of your environment. It should indicate who the responsible parties are, who are the control owners. What does your environment look like? What is that data flow look like? Network diagrams, all the pieces required in there to say, I have a pretty good idea of my environment, a really good idea. Purposefully, I have documented, I understand how information flows through my environment. And now in relation to those controls, how am I, as an organization, as a contractor, how am I adhering to those? And that's what the SSP is going to indicate. And sort of that last part, as far as steps go, is then establishing the applicable processes and procedures and developing plans as an organization to actually support all of those initiatives, right? If the process is, I need, policies and procedures to make sure these things happen. Sometimes a lot of the times that takes funding and budgeting from the organization to say, hey, we're going to have to get this done and put that into order. If you don't have it, essentially you're just doing this ad hoc, and that's not going to fly under DFARS as well. Again, that due care, due diligence piece, showing that you intend to meet the control requirements.
So you distilled that down to 8 steps. That sounds really easy to do, right?
Yeah, definitely not easy to do. This is why everybody's been pushing all along since CMMC was discussed in early or mid 2020, that it takes time and effort. And on average, we're seeing anywhere from 12 to 18, even up to 20 months from ground zero to get these things going and start taking action. And so one of the last key pieces of this, Corey, that gets really gets sort of brushed under the rug and not really paid too much attention to is, part of DFARS is the control requirements plus reporting. And that reporting piece, when we talk about cyber incident reporting, is that you have specific requirements, again, under the contractual requirements of DFARS to report an incident. And when I bring this up to a lot of the defense industrial base, they're like, well, I know I had to do that, but I don't really know what the specifics are. And, I don't know what I even need to do. And this isn't something that you're going to want to wait until an incident occurs, because some of the steps required in here take some time to establish just to be able to report an incident to the DoD. And so as you can see here on the slide, there's some pieces of that, but essentially there's a 72-hour window. And what they're going to be looking for is getting some evidence of that compromise. They're going to want some copies of whatever was determined to be found as malicious software or just indicators of compromise. They may want to have you preserve or protect images of those information systems, which could mean you have a core system in your environment that is now being brought in for investigation or forensics, which could impact your organization. They're wanting the capture of data for a certain amount of time. And again, if you don't have those DFARS requirements or the NIST 80171 controls in place, you wouldn't have these capabilities available to you in that incident reporting. And so a key piece of this is, in order to submit that incident to the DoD, you have to be able to prove your identity. And to do that, there's an application process for getting a medium assurance certificate, which is essentially a third-party external certification authority. Like, IdenTrust is an example. They have a really good DoD program that validates who you are as an organization, who's making those claims to the DoD. And that can take some time, because you have to provide forms of identification. You have to provide a notary has to be involved to validate who you are. And there's timeframes on that as well. And so this is key. And this can get you in trouble, in a number of ways, from contractual, from the Department of Justice, for not adhering to this. And so this could be a significant impact to your organization. And we know, Corey, that this isn't a matter of likelihood, right? The common cliche statement is, it's not if, but when. And so we want to make sure that this is highlighted, loud and clear. We can't ignore this part. And if you haven't done this yet, definitely get that done ASAP.
Thank you for that, Jeremiah. And I wanted to bring Chris in. Chris, when we're talking about what Simpatico can do to help engage some of these things, can you give us a little bit of an idea of maybe some of the things that we've done with other customers, or some of the things that we have coming up that we can offer?
Thanks, Corey. Yeah, there's several ways that we can help. No matter what level you're on, the biggest thing is first kind of assessing where you are, what that environment is, and how we can help. But Jeremiah does a really great job of really just bringing things down to layman's terms, assessing what your risk is, but more importantly, what steps you need to take and how those are prioritized. Another way that we can help is a lot of the times this load falls on someone within the organization that may or may not be the decision maker, or illustrating those big points that are going to be critical to help management and or the leadership team understand the significance of these upcoming requirements.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. When we're looking at engagements that we've done in the past, is there a certain point in that process? We're looking at the 8 steps of really what you need to be doing right now for DFARS. Is there a point where it makes more sense to reach out to a company like Simpatico or to another RPO that might be able to help a defense industrial base company be able to hit some of those compliance targets, or is it just kind of anywhere in that process?
That's a good point. We can help at any point, because we have organizations that we've helped that are well versed in the process and have the resources internally and are well far off in the process. And we also help organizations who don't haven't really anywhere to start with. They're at square one, don't know where to go, don't even know where to begin. So we can help from anywhere between those 1 and 8. We'll just tailor it to wherever we can do to help whoever is in need.
Yeah, and just to add to what Chris is saying, the key here is, like he said, there's a lot of the defense industrial base that are small businesses. That is key here. They don't have the internal resources to provide proper IT support to themselves, or they're outsourcing that, or whatever the case may be. And now to essentially assign someone as your compliance division of this requirement that you're going to have to adhere to is, very overwhelming. And if that person doesn't have the experience, the industry knowledge to understand and translate that, you're setting the business off on the wrong foot right away. And so it's key that you have a partnership with someone who really understands these things and can bring you in and go through a step-by-step process, which is part of what Chris was mentioning. We've developed a compliance management offering that essentially helps you at whatever step you are in your process. But we can become your compliance division for you. We work with you. We work with your teams, whether you have internal IT, external IT, leveraging managed service providers. We're just coming in to help keep that ball moving forward, help translate the requirements, help any of the leadership understand what they're up against, and keep that ball moving in the right direction. But doing that in a way that is efficient for the business as well, right? Because we don't want to destroy the business in the sake of compliance, but that's a business decision. If the compliance is a large enough part of revenue of that organization, then the investment really does need to be made to do this right. Because what's going to happen is, after 18 to 20 so months of effort to get to the finish line, to get assessed by a C3PA, only be able to be told, hey, all of that effort you did was great, but you're significantly deficient in all these areas and you really don't understand. And now you've lost the ability to win these future contracts, which is revenue for your organization. And so we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. And then when we get to the end, we have a high level of confidence that you're really meeting the requirements as an organization and you're not worried about that impact to business.
So Jeremiah, this is something that we're actually living in every day. I mean, Simpatico itself is actually going through the process of CMMC certification and becoming one of the first MSPs in the world to really hit that certification of CMMC level 2.
Yeah, I mean, that's an accurate statement, Corey. I mean, and again, some misconception along the way of what does that mean for providers of the defense industrial base. The people who are supporting these contractors also have access to some of this information. A lot of the times they have very, very close access because they're managing the systems that are either store processing or transmitting that information. And so as a managed service provider, a managed security service provider, it's key that we understand, or you understand as a contractor, what level of involvement and access your MSP or MSSP has, or even different subcontractors or third parties into your environment that have to adhere to this. And so as an MSP, we acknowledge that, and we're working diligently internally to make sure that we're meeting the letter of the law as well, so that we don't get to a point of a customer of ours has been now assessed and we're their MSP and they fail because our shortcomings in providing or establishing the right controls to meet the requirements, which is not good for anybody, right? And so we want to make sure we're compliant. So any of the customers that we're helping already have that safety net that, hey, Simpatico is meeting the letter of the law, they're already compliant. I know if I'm leveraging them, they're where they need to be, and I just need to work forward with my stuff internally. And so that's a very important point.
Thank you guys for your time today.